The thunder of rifle fire shattered the desert's silence, and Elise Whitmore pressed herself against her painted mare's neck as stone fragments exploded from the canyon wall above. Her heart hammered against her ribs with the same desperate rhythm she'd felt 3 years ago, when cholera took her parents, when creditors seized their Missouri farm, when Thomas Hartwell had looked her in the eye and announced their engagement was no longer suitable, now that she had nothing to offer. But this terror was different. Raw. Immediate. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth as bullets ricocheted off red sandstone, sending sparks dancing through the afternoon heat. 20 yards away, 3 armed riders perched on the canyon rim like vultures, smoke drifting from their rifle barrels as they reloaded with practiced efficiency. "Stay down." Dassan's voice cut through the chaos, steady despite the danger. The Apache warrior moved with fluid grace, pulling her behind the horse as another volley shattered the rocks where she'd been sitting moments before. A razor-sharp fragment caught her cheek, and warm blood mixed with the dust coating her face. 2 weeks earlier, when she'd stepped off that freight wagon in Whispering Pines, Elise had never imagined her mother's inheritance would lead to this crouched behind a trembling horse, while hired killers tried to murder her for a piece of land she'd never seen. The blue stone pendant Elizabeth Whitmore had left her pressed against her chest through her worn buckskin dress, its weight somehow heavier now, as if it carried secrets she was only beginning to understand. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, a whisper from childhood. "Someday you'll understand why we had to leave Colorado, Elise. Someday you'll need to be stronger than I was." Elizabeth had died when Elise was 12, taking her secrets with her, leaving only cryptic warnings about powerful men who never forget a slight, and strange nightmares that plagued her daughter's sleep dreams of a man with cold gray eyes and silver hair who spoke her mother's name like a curse. Throughout her childhood in Missouri, those nightmares had come regularly. She would wake crying from visions of her mother, standing in a burning building, reaching out to her, while flames consumed everything around them. Sometimes, the man with gray eyes would be there too, laughing as the fire spread. Her father, Jonathan Whitmore, would comfort her after these episodes, but his face always grew troubled when she described the dreams. "Your mother had enemies," he would say carefully. "Powerful people who didn't like that she stood up for what was right. That's why we left Colorado, to keep you safe." But Jonathan had never told her the full truth. He'd died without revealing that Elizabeth hadn't just fled from enemies, she'd been building a case against them, documenting their crimes, preparing for a day when justice might finally be possible. The pendant around Elise's neck wasn't just a memento of a dead mother. It was a weapon that Elizabeth had forged across decades, waiting for the right moment to strike back at the man who had destroyed her life. Now hiding behind a horse, while bullets sang overhead, those childhood terrors were taking shape in the harsh light of the New Mexico desert. Wicasa, the Apache elder whose weathered face bore the scars of 60 years in this unforgiving country, fired his Spencer carbine from behind a boulder. His traditional buckskin shirt was dark with sweat eagle feathers in his graying hair, catching the brutal afternoon light. "3 shooters," he called to Dassan in accented English. "Thorne's men. They followed us from the town." The name Thorne sent ice through Elise's veins. She had heard it whispered in her nightmares, had seen it written in her mother's hidden papers, had felt it like a shadow over her entire life. Lucian Thorne, the man with gray eyes who had haunted her dreams, was real, and he had found her at last. The old warrior's hands remained steady as he reloaded, but Elise caught the slight tremor in his left arm, a reminder that he was no longer the young fighter who had once ridden the war trails against cavalry units and Texas Rangers. Still, his shots were precise, each one carefully aimed to keep their attackers honest, while conserving ammunition they couldn't spare. "How did they find us so quickly?" Elise asked, trying to keep the panic from her voice. Dassan crouched beside her, his dark eyes scanning the canyon for escape routes. At 30, he moved with the controlled intensity of a man who had learned survival in the hardest school imaginable. The puckered scar on his ribs, visible through a tear in his shirt, spoke of past encounters with white law that had ended in violence. But there was something else in his manner, a protective instinctiveness that seemed to focus specifically on her, though they had known each other for only days. "Someone in town talked," he said grimly. "Or they were watching all along, waiting for you to lead them to Willow Springs." The implications were chilling. If Thorne's people had been observing her since her arrival in Whispering Pines, then they knew everything, her routes, her allies, her plans. The trap that had driven them into this canyon might be just the beginning of a much larger scheme. "The dry riverbed," Dasan said, pointing toward a creek bed lined with cottonwoods, whose leaves rustled in the hot wind. "We can use the banks for cover, but we need to move now before they bring up more men." He fired once, his aim deliberate and controlled. One of the horses on the rim stumbled, throwing its rider, who scrambled behind the rocks, cursing loudly enough for the sound to echo off the canyon walls. "Now we move." The chase that followed stripped away any romantic notions Elise might have harbored about the American West. This wasn't the noble frontier of dime novels, this was survival at its most brutal. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as they ran their boots, sliding on loose, scree lungs, burning from the thin air and the bitter taste of fear. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew closer. Horses' hooves striking stone, the jingle of spurs' shouts as their hunters tried to cut off escape routes. Elise's buckskin dress, practical for town wear, became a liability in the open country. The leather held heat like a furnace, and dust worked into every fold and crease. Within an hour, her water bottle was half empty, and she understood with crystalline clarity why Dasan and Wikasa had looked so grim when they'd grabbed supplies from the stable. This was country that could kill you simply for being unprepared, where the margin between life and death was measured in drops of water and degrees of shade. Her painted mare, a sturdy horse that had seemed full of energy in town, now moved with her head, low foam flecking her neck as she fought to maintain pace in the crushing heat. The animal's labored breathing reminded Elise of her father's final days, when pneumonia had filled his lungs and every breath was a struggle. She pushed the memory away. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford while bullets were flying. They reached the dry riverbed as the afternoon heat became nearly unbearable. The horses picked their way carefully down the sandy slope, hooves sliding on loose stones that clinked together like broken pottery. Here at least they were hidden from distant observation. But the temperature was actually worse in the confined space, reflected and concentrated by the rock walls, until the air itself seemed to shimmer with malice. A sound echoed through the canyon that froze all three of them. The scream of a mountain lion, somewhere ahead in the maze of stone passages. The horse's ears pricked forward, and Elise felt her mare tense beneath her, every muscle coiled for flight. She had heard that sound once before, during her childhood in Missouri, when a cougar had killed two of their neighbors' sheep. The memory of finding those torn carcasses still made her stomach clench. "Old male," Wikasa said quietly, reading the nuances in the cat's cry that were invisible to untrained ears. "Defending territory around water. He's hungry, which makes him dangerous. We'll have to be very careful." They had no choice but to continue. Their bottles were already running dangerously low, and the alternative was to backtrack into the guns of their pursuers. They moved through the twisting canyon with every sense alert, knowing that the cougar could be watching from any of the countless ledges overhead, yellow eyes tracking their movement as it decided whether they represented threat or prey. The attack came not from the cougar, but from their human pursuers who had somehow circled ahead and positioned themselves on the canyon rim. The first shot rang out just as they reached a wider section, where scraggly cottonwoods provided minimal shade, their leaves rustling with a sound like whispered warnings. Elise threw herself from the saddle as bullets spanged off the rocks around them, and the reports echoing and re-echoing, until the sound became a continuous roar that seemed to shake the very stones. She landed hard on the sandy bottom, her shoulder grinding against rock, but managed to keep hold of her father's Colt revolver, the one weapon he had taught her to use before his death. "Remember?" Jonathan's voice echoed in her memory. A gun is only as good as the person holding it. Accuracy matters more than speed, and the will to use it matters most of all. The gunfight that followed bore no resemblance to the dramatic confrontations she'd read about in adventure stories. This was grinding patient work where inches of cover meant the difference between life and death, where every shot had to count because ammunition was precious and mistakes were final. The desert heat made metal too hot to touch, sweat stung her eyes, and the constant threat of running out of water added another layer of desperation to every decision. Dasan was already positioned behind a fallen log, his rifle steady as he searched for targets among the rocks above. His movements were economical, precise, wasting no motion, betraying no emotion. She had seen him in town, trading with merchants, and speaking quietly with other Apache. But this was the first time she had witnessed the warrior that reservation agents feared and cavalry officers respected. Wicasa had found shelter behind a boulder and was methodically returning fire, his shots spaced and deliberate. Both men used a complex system of hand signals, raised fingers indicating enemy positions, subtle gestures coordinating their movements. It was a silent language developed through years of hunting and warfare, refined by necessity until communication could happen without sound. Elise fired once at a muzzle flash on the rim, saw stone chips fly where her bullets struck, but had no idea whether she'd hit anything. The heavy Colt's recoil nearly knocked the weapon from her hands. And she realized with humbling clarity how different shooting at tin cans was from shooting at men who were trying to kill her. Her father's lessons had covered the mechanics of firing accurately, but nothing had prepared her for the psychological weight of taking aim at another human being. The sun crawled across the sky with agonizing slowness while they remained pinned down. Thirst became a constant torment. Her lips cracked, her tongue felt swollen, and mirages began dancing at the edges of her vision. She found herself thinking about the cool streams of Missouri, about well water drawn up in wooden buckets, about anything except the growing certainty that they might die of dehydration before the bullets found them. As shadows began to lengthen and the heat became marginally less murderous, their situation grew more desperate rather than better. They were running low on ammunition, and their water was nearly gone, and there was no clear escape route from the rocky maze that had become their prison. Worse, the sound of sustained gunfire would carry for miles in the thin desert air, possibly drawing more enemies or alerting anyone in the territory that something significant was happening in this remote canyon. It was Wicasa who finally broke the deadlock, moving with surprising agility for his age. The old warrior worked his way along the base of the canyon wall, using every scrap of cover, until he reached a position where he could see one of their attackers, clearly silhouetted against the darkening sky. His single shot was perfectly placed, dropping the man from his perch in a shower of loose stone and dust. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. The remaining attackers pulled back from the rim, their fire becoming sporadic and poorly aimed as they realized they were no longer hunting helpless prey, but fighting seasoned warriors who could strike back with deadly precision. The balance of fear had shifted, and suddenly the hunters were wondering if they might become the hunted. In the gathering darkness, Dasan and Elise were able to collect the horses and move deeper into the canyon system, following what appeared to be an ancient game trail. Worn smooth by countless generations of deer elk and smaller creatures seeking water. The path twisted through rock formations that looked like the ruins of some prehistoric city, carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes that seemed almost alive in the twilight. They rode in tense silence for another hour, the temperature dropping with shocking rapidity as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. The desert night came quickly and completely transforming the landscape from furnace to icebox in the space of minutes. Elise found herself shivering in her buckskin dress, grateful for the warmth of the horse beneath her, but acutely aware of how exposed they remained to both natural dangers and human enemies. Finally, they stopped at a natural basin sheltered on three sides by towering red walls that rose like the ramparts of some ancient fortress. A few mesquite bushes provided cover for the animals, and Wicasa pronounced the position defensible if they were discovered during the night. The rocky walls would funnel any attack into predictable approaches, giving them advantages they had lacked in the open canyon. There was no visible water, but Dasan knelt in the sandy bottom of the wash and began digging with his bare hands, following techniques passed down through generations of desert dwellers. 2 feet down, his fingers found moisture, and soon a small seep was producing enough muddy liquid to water the horses and refill their bottles. It tasted of minerals and grit with a metallic aftertaste that spoke of the iron-rich rocks it had filtered through. But it was life itself in this unforgiving country. As they made a cold camp, no fire that might betray their position to searching enemies, Elise felt the weight of how completely her world had changed in the space of a single day. This morning, she had been a woman of property, however modest, with the theoretical protection of law and society. She had owned a small house in town, had credit at the general store, had been making plans to start a business, teaching children to read and write. Now she was a fugitive dependent entirely on the skills and goodwill of 2 Apache men for her very survival, hiding in the desert, while armed killers searched for her. The transformation was so complete and sudden that part of her mind refused to accept it as real. This had to be another nightmare like the ones that had plagued her childhood. Soon she would wake up in her own bed, safe and surrounded by familiar things. But the pain in her shoulder from the hard landing, the taste of gritty water, and the cold wind cutting through her inadequate clothing, all testified to the harsh reality of her situation. This was no dream. This was her life now, at least, until they could find a way to expose Thorne's crimes and restore some semblance of justice to the territory. As they shared their meager supplies and tried to rest despite the danger, Wikasa began to speak in a low voice about the history of this land, perhaps trying to distract them all from their immediate peril. He told stories of the ancient peoples who had carved the petroglyphs they had seen, of Spanish explorers who had died of thirst within miles of water, of Apache warriors who had used these same canyons to evade cavalry patrols during the wars that had shaped the territory. This land tests everyone who comes to it. The old man said, his weathered face thoughtful in the starlight. It shows you who you really are, strips away everything that isn't essential. Some people break under that pressure. Others become stronger than they ever imagined possible. Elise fingered her mother's pendant through her shirt, feeling its familiar weight and warmth. There were secrets here, connections she was only beginning to understand. But she could sense that the blue stone held answers to questions she had been asking all her life. Elizabeth Whitmore had left her more than an inheritance. She had left her a puzzle that would either save her life or get her killed. In the distance, a coyote howled a sound, both lonely and wild, that seemed to capture the essence of this beautiful, terrible country. Other voices answered until the desert rang with their ancient song, a reminder that humans were newcomers here, intruders in a land that had belonged to other creatures for thousands of years before the first settlements appeared. As the desert stars emerged in their brilliant profusion, unmarred by the coal smoke and gaslights of eastern cities, Elise found herself thinking about the chain of events that had brought her to this place. Her parents' deaths had seemed like the end of the world at the time, but perhaps they had been necessary to set her on the path that led here. The broken engagement that had left her with nothing had freed her to come west. Even the loss of their farm had been essential, because it had forced her to open the sealed envelope that contained her mother's deed. Everything in her life seemed to have been leading to this moment, hiding in a desert canyon, while the man who had haunted her nightmares finally revealed himself as a real and deadly enemy. But she was no longer the frightened child who had awakened crying from dreams of fire and gray eyes. She was a woman grown armed with her father's pistol and protected by allies who had already proven their loyalty with blood. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, fresh challenges, and quite possibly death. But tonight, under the infinite stars of the southwestern sky, Elise Whitmore felt something she had never experienced before. the cold, hard certainty that she would not go quietly into the darkness that Lucian Thorne had planned for her. The war for her mother's legacy was just beginning, and she intended to win it. The landscape around Willow Springs was unlike anything Elise had imagined from studying her mother's deed during the long journey west from Missouri. They reached the oasis just before dawn, when the desert air still held the night's coolness, and the rocks hadn't yet begun radiating the stored heat that would make the day another furnace of endurance. The springs themselves were nothing short of miraculous clear water, bubbling up from some deep underground source, creating a pocket of green life in the midst of red stone and gray-green desert scrub. Ancient cottonwood trees spread their massive branches over pools that reflected the morning stars, their leaves rustling with a sound like gentle applause. The music of flowing water seemed almost supernatural after the silence of their nighttime flight through the canyons. Standing at the edge of the largest pool, watching the water well up from invisible depths below, Elise understood for the first time why men would kill for this place. In a land where entire settlements lived or died based on access to reliable water sources, where rivers could disappear overnight and wells could run dry without warning, Willow Springs represented wealth beyond calculation. This wasn't just an oasis, it was security, prosperity, and life itself in liquid form. But the beauty of the place was marred by evidence of recent conflict. The ground around the springs was torn up by the hooves of many horses, creating a churned mess of mud and sand that spoke of armed men camping here in large numbers. Someone had built hasty earthworks, attempting to divert part of the flow, and the incomplete construction suggested they had been interrupted or driven off before finishing their work. Fresh brass cartridge cases glinted in the sand like deadly flowers, and several of the cottonwoods bore the scars of bullet strikes on their massive trunks. Wicasa knelt by the water's edge, cupping the precious liquid in his weathered hands and tasting it with the careful attention of someone whose life had often depended on reading the subtle signs that water could reveal. His dark eyes closed as he analyzed what his senses told him: temperature, mineral content, and the faint flavors that might indicate contamination or purity. "Good water," he pronounced after a long moment. "Clean and cold, rising from deep places where the earth filters out impurities. My people have used this place since before the Spanish came north from Mexico, since before the Anglos crossed the great river. The old ones called it Sacred Springs because it never fails, even in the worst drought years." He gestured toward a series of petroglyphs carved into the rock face behind the largest pool spirals, and animal figures, human handprints and symbols whose meanings had been lost to time. The ancient art spoke of human presence, stretching back centuries of countless generations who had recognized this place as special, worth protecting, worth fighting for, if necessary. Elise spread her mother's deed on a flat boulder, comparing the legal description to the physical landmarks around them. The boundaries were precisely defined and legally unambiguous. The springs and approximately 160 surrounding acres belonged to her by right of inheritance, properly recorded in the Territorial Land Office. But as she studied the document in the growing light of dawn, something nagged at her consciousness like a half-remembered dream. The pendant her mother had left her seemed to grow warmer against her chest, as if responding to this place with some kind of recognition. She had worn it every day since Elizabeth's death, but it had never felt quite like this before. Alive, almost pulsing with its own rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the springs themselves. "Your mother was a careful woman," Dasan observed, studying the deed over her shoulder. His presence was both comforting and unsettling. She found herself acutely aware of his proximity, the way his dark hair caught the morning light, the controlled strength in his movements as he examined their surroundings for potential threats. She knew this place would be coveted by powerful men who don't respect legal documents when they conflict with their desires. There was something in his voice, a personal edge, that suggested his words came from bitter experience rather than general observation. Elise was beginning to understand that her inheritance of Willow Springs had placed her in the middle of conflicts that stretched back much further than her own life, involving people and events she was only starting to comprehend. Before she could ask what he meant, the distant sound of gunfire echoed across the desert from the direction of whispering pines. The shots came in ragged volleys, rather than the organized patterns of a military drill suggesting a sustained battle, rather than a simple confrontation. All three of them stood silent, listening intently, until the reports faded into the morning stillness and were replaced by the normal sounds of the desert awakening birds calling from the cottonwoods, the rustle of small animals in the brush. Like Thorne's making his move, Wicasa said grimly, his weathered face creased with worry for friends and allies they had left behind in town. He won't wait for judges and lawyers now that we've escaped his first trap. The man has patience when it serves his purposes, but when he's crossed, he strikes back immediately and without mercy. The name sent another chill through Elise's body. Throughout the desperate flight from town and the gunfight in the canyon, she had been focused on immediate survival, on bullets and thirst and the basic mechanics of staying alive. But now, in the relative safety of Willow Springs, the larger implications of her situation began to sink in. Lucian Thorne, the man from her nightmares, and the enemy her mother had fled, the shadow that had hung over her entire life, had finally found her. Over the next several hours, as they worked to establish defensive positions around the springs and tried to plan their next moves, the scope of Thorne's campaign became increasingly clear through a series of disturbing reports. The first intelligence came from a young Apache brave, who arrived with his horse lathered and exhausting, bringing news that made their blood run cold. Thorne's men attacked our camp at Copper Creek before dawn. The messenger reported in heavily accented English, his young face grim with the weight of terrible news. They came wearing war paint and carrying Apache weapons, but we could tell they were white men pretending to be warriors. 3 of our elders were killed, and several women and children were taken captive. The survivors are scattered in the mountains, afraid to return to their homes. The implications were staggering. Thorne wasn't just targeting Elise personally, he was orchestrating a campaign of terror designed to inflame racial tensions throughout the territory. By staging fake Apache attacks, he could justify massive retaliation against all native peoples, while positioning himself as the defender of civilization against savage threats. More disturbing news arrived throughout the morning, carried by a steady stream of refugees, defectors, and observers who had witnessed the rapidly escalating crisis. Dr. Carter sent word through Hannah Price that Thorne had called in all his debts, simultaneously demanding immediate payment from everyone who owed him money for medical supplies, farming equipment, building materials, or any of the dozen other enterprises he controlled. When people couldn't pay, and few could given the deliberately inflated prices and predatory terms he had used, Thorne offered an alternative signed statement supporting his claim to Willow Springs and other disputed properties in exchange for debt forgiveness. Some folks are already talking about signing. Hannah reported with obvious shame and fear. Her usually neat appearance was disheveled from hard riding, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, worrying about her students and community. They have families to think about, and Thorne's making it clear that anyone who doesn't cooperate will be ruined or worse. But the most ominous intelligence came from an unexpected source. Old Pete, a grizzled prospector, who had been working claims in the mountains north of town. Pete was one of those desert survivors who seemed to exist on whiskey and pure stubbornness, a man who had outlasted boom and bust cycles, Apache raids, Mexican bandits, and every other hazard the territory could produce. His appearance at Willow Springs, riding a mule that looked as ancient and indestructible as its owner, brought news that changed everything. Thorne's brought in an army. Pete reported as he accepted coffee and a share of their meager food supplies. Not just gunfighters, though. He's got plenty of those professional killers from Arizona and Colorado who work for whoever pays best. But he's also got federal marshals with suspicious credentials, territorial militia units that look more like private armies, and Apache raiders who ain't Apache at all when you look close. The old prospector had spent decades reading the subtle signs of the desert, learning to distinguish between genuine threats and manufactured dangers, between authentic Apache sign and white men's clumsy attempts at deception. What he had observed from his mountain hideouts painted a picture of conspiracy that reached far beyond simple land theft. He's staging some kind of war. Pete continued, his rheumy eyes bright with the intelligence that had kept him alive through 40 years in the harshest country on the continent. Fake Apache attacks to justify bringing in troops, fake federal authority to seize disputed land, fake militia units to enforce his will. It's bigger than just revenge against you, miss. This is about controlling the whole territory, the water, the mineral rights, the government itself. But Pete brought hope as well as terrifying news. During his years of solitary prospecting, following promising veins through abandoned mines and forgotten shafts, he had discovered something that could potentially change the entire balance of power. Hidden in an old mine shaft, sealed behind rockfalls that had occurred years earlier, were wooden crates containing documents that someone had desperately wanted to hide. There's enough evidence in that mine to hang half the territorial government. Pete said, his voice dropping to a whisper despite their isolation. Land fraud, bribery, murder contracts, correspondence with officials all the way to Washington. Someone spent years collecting proof of corruption, building a case that could destroy dozens of powerful men. The implications were staggering, but the practical challenges were equally daunting. The hidden cache was located in treacherous mountain terrain, accessible only through partially collapsed tunnels that might give way completely at any moment. Retrieving the evidence would require time, expertise, and manpower they didn't have, especially with Thorne's forces actively hunting them. As they discussed their dwindling options and tried to formulate some kind of plan, Elise found herself unconsciously touching her mother's pendant through her shirt. The blue stone seemed warmer than usual, and she had the strangest sensation that it was trying to tell her something important, if only she were clever enough to understand its message. That evening, as the desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, she made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about her inheritance. While examining the pendant more closely in the fading light, holding it up to catch the last rays of the sun, she noticed that the blue stone wasn't just decorative. It was actually thin enough to let light through when held at the correct angle. And there were markings inside the stone itself, like ink trapped in amber. She gasped as the light revealed symbols etched into the inner surface of the stone, not a complete map or message, but what appeared to be half of a coded communication. Some of the markings matched symbols she had seen on her deed, but others were completely unfamiliar, suggesting that the pendant contained only part of a larger puzzle. "It's incomplete," she said, showing Dasan and Wikasa what she had discovered. "This is only half of something. The other half must be hidden somewhere else." Wikasa studied the pendant with the intense concentration of a man who had spent decades learning to read signs that others missed entirely. His weathered fingers traced the symbols visible through the translucent stone, and his dark eyes grew thoughtful as he considered the implications. "Your mother was wise in the ways of survival," he said slowly. "If someone stole this from you, they would have only half the secret. The other half could be anywhere hidden in your belongings, concealed in legal documents, even tattooed on someone's skin. She made sure that no single piece of evidence could destroy you, but also that no single piece could save you. You must find the other half to understand what she was trying to tell you." The revelation added a new layer of urgency to their situation. Elizabeth Whitmore hadn't just left her daughter a water source and mineral rights, she had left her a weapon in the war against Lucian Thorne. But only if Elise could assemble all the pieces before Thorne's conspiracy destroyed her. As they settled in for what might be their last night of relative safety, Elise found herself studying her mother's deed with new eyes, looking for the hidden symbols and secret messages that might complete the puzzle Elizabeth had created. The legal document that had seemed straightforward when she first inherited it was revealing layers of complexity that spoke to a brilliant mind working across decades to protect her daughter from an enemy who would never forget or forgive. The war for Willow Springs was about to enter its decisive phase, and Elise was beginning to understand that the stakes were much higher than simple land ownership. This was about the kind of society the American West would become, one governed by law and justice, or one where might made right, and the powerful could take whatever they wanted from the weak. Her mother had been preparing for this battle for 20 years, and now it was Elise's turn to take up the fight. The pendant around her neck pulsed with warmth in the cool desert air, as if Elizabeth's spirit were somehow present, guiding her daughter toward the truth that would either save them all or get them killed in the attempt. The discovery of the pendant's secret was only the beginning of a night filled with revelations that would reshape everything Elise thought she knew about her family's history. Working by the light of a carefully shielded lamp, she and her companions examined every inch of her mother's deed with the intensity of scholars deciphering an ancient manuscript, looking for the hidden messages that might complete the puzzle Elizabeth had created. It was Dassan who made the next breakthrough, his keen eyes spotting marks along the border of the document that looked like decorative flourishes, but were actually symbols that matched those visible inside the pendant. When they held the blue stone's light over the corresponding marks on the deed, new text appeared, words written in ink that only became visible when exposed to the specific wavelength of light that filtered through the pendant's crystalline structure. The hidden message written in Elizabeth's precise script was like receiving a letter from beyond the grave. I'm my dearest Elise. If you are reading this, then Lucian Thorne has found you, as I always feared he would. 20 years ago in Colorado Territory, when you were barely 2 years old, Thorne tried to steal my mining claims through bribery, forged documents, and corrupted territorial officials. When I exposed his crimes and had him driven from the territory, he swore a blood oath that he would destroy me and any family I might have. The springs you have inherited are not valuable merely for their water, though that alone would make you wealthy in this desert country. Beneath Willow Springs lies a vein of silver ore, so rich it could finance the development of an entire territory, or fund a private army large enough to control one. Thorne has known about this silver for 20 years, and his every action since losing Colorado has been calculated to eventually claim it. But beware, my daughter. Thorne has spent 2 decades corrupting officials throughout New Mexico territory. He owns judges, sheriffs, territorial administrators, even some federal appointees. He has built a network of power that reaches from local mining camps to the halls of Congress. You cannot trust the normal channels of law and justice because he controls too many of them. The evidence you need to destroy his conspiracy is hidden in 3 locations. First, the cave behind the waterfall, where the springs flow deepest into the mountain. Second, the abandoned mine that the old prospector will tell you about. And third, in the private papers of Sheriff Pike, who has been Thorne's chief enforcer since the day he pinned on his badge. Trust only those who prove themselves through sacrifice. Many who seem to be your allies may be Thorne's creatures placed to watch and betray you when the moment is right. But there are good people in this territory, people who still believe in justice over gold, law over might. Find them, unite them, and strike back before Thorne can complete his plan to seize control of the entire Southwest. Be strong, my daughter. Be stronger than I was. The pendant will guide you to the cave, but only when the springs run at their lowest, which happens for just a few days each year when the mountain snowmelt ends. But the summer rains have not yet begun. You will know the time by signs the Apache can teach you to read. I love you more than life itself, and I pray that this message reaches you in time to save not just your life, but the future of everyone who believes that right should triumph over might. Your devoted mother, Elizabeth Whitmore. The silence that followed the reading was broken only by the sound of water flowing over stone and the distant calls of night birds in the cottonwoods. Each of them was processing the implications of Elizabeth's revelation at the enormous scope of Thorne's conspiracy, the wealth that lay beneath their feet, and the terrible realization that they were facing an enemy who had spent 20 years preparing for this confrontation. "The waterfall," Elise said finally, looking around the oasis. "I don't see any waterfall here." Wicasa smiled for the first time since she had known him, and the expression transforming his weathered features and revealing the humor that had sustained him through decades of hardship and loss. "Not above ground, at least not now. But when the spring floods are heavy, when winter snow melts from the high peaks and the underground channels fill beyond their normal capacity, there is a place where the water falls down into the mountain itself. Your mother knew this land better than she ever let anyone realize." The old warrior went on to explain the seasonal patterns that governed the springs, the subtle signs that indicated when underground water levels were rising or falling, and the brief window each year when the hidden cave would be accessible. According to his calculations, they had perhaps 3 days before that window opened, 3 days to survive Thorne's assault and prepare for an expedition into the depths of the mountain. But their planning was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving carefully through the darkness toward their position. All 3 of them reached for their weapons, expecting the final assault that would end their resistance before it could truly begin. Instead, they found themselves facing a group of Apache warriors who materialized from the shadows like spirits of the desert night, led by a young war chief named Nish, whose face was painted for battle and whose bearing spoke of barely controlled rage. They had come not as enemies, but as allies united by a common cause. "My people are angry beyond words," Nalnish explained as they gathered around the carefully shielded fire, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "But we are not fools who strike blindly at shadows. We know the difference between our own warriors and white men playing dress-up in war paint. This Thorne seeks to make us the enemy of all people so he can take what he wants while the soldiers hunt us through the mountains." The war chief brought intelligence that confirmed their worst fears about the scope of Thorne's operation. Throughout the territory, his fake Apache raiders were preparing to strike simultaneously at dozens of settlements, creating a wave of terror that would justify massive military intervention. Real Apache leaders had been trying desperately to prevent their young warriors from retaliating, knowing that any genuine native violence would play directly into Thorne's hands. But Nish also brought something more valuable than intelligence. He brought allies. More riders had been arriving throughout the night, not just Apache, but also settlers, miners, ranchers, and townspeople who had finally understood what Thorne was doing to their territory. Dr. Carter came having closed his practice to join the fight for his community's survival. Hannah Price arrived with several other teachers and their older students, all armed and determined to protect the schools and children they served. Even some of Thorne's own men began defecting as the true scope of his plan became clear. These were rough men who had signed on for land disputes and claimed jumping not for genocide and territorial conquest. Led by a former deputy named Carson, who had been sickened by Pike's increasingly murderous orders, they brought crucial intelligence about Thorne's forces' defensive positions and planned timeline. "He's moving faster than we expected." Carson reported, his face haggard with exhaustion and the moral weight of the crimes he had witnessed. "The fake Apache attacks start tomorrow at dawn, hitting settlements all across the territory simultaneously. By noon, he'll have territorial militia moving to secure all disputed land areas. By evening, he plans to have himself appointed as territorial administrator with emergency powers to restore order." The timeline was staggering in its ambition and terrifying in its implications. Within a single day, Thorne planned to transform himself from a wealthy mining baron into the de facto ruler of an entire territory, with the legal authority to seize any land, arrest any person, and kill any enemy who stood in his way. By dawn, they had nearly 50 people gathered at Willow Springs, all united by the understanding that if Thorne's conspiracy succeeded, none of them would be safe. But they were still outnumbered by his forces, and time was running out. with the inexorable approach of sunrise and the beginning of his orchestrated campaign of terror. It was then that Elise proposed a plan so audacious, it left even the experienced warriors speechless. Instead of waiting for Thorn to implement his conspiracy, and then trying to respond to events he controlled, they would strike first, not at his forces, which were too numerous and well-positioned to defeat in direct combat, but at the foundations of his power itself. "We can't outfight him," she said, looking around at the assembled group of farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and warriors who represented everything good about the territory. "But we can expose him. If we can get the evidence from those 3 locations, my mother mentioned the cave here, Pete's hidden mine, and Pike's private papers, we can prove his crimes to federal authorities who aren't on his payroll." The plan they developed over the next few hours was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and absolute trust among people who had known each other for mere days. While Nalnish and his warriors created diversions throughout the territory to draw away Thorn's forces, smaller groups would infiltrate each of the evidence locations and secure the documents that could destroy his conspiracy. It's still suicide. Carson protested his intimate knowledge of Thorn's defenses, making him acutely aware of how desperate their situation had become. "Even if we get the evidence, how do we get it to someone with the authority to act on it? Thorn owns half the territorial government and has the other half too scared to move against him." But Elise had been thinking about that problem since reading her mother's hidden message, and she had an answer that surprised everyone, including herself. Among Elizabeth's papers, hidden in the same secret compartment that had contained the deed, was a letter of introduction to a federal circuit judge named Harrison, who had been investigating territorial corruption for years. The judge was currently in Santa Fe holding court and reportedly beyond Thorn's influence. If they could reach him with evidence, he had the authority to issue warrants that even territorial militias would have to respect. The cave first. Elise decided looking toward the springs where her mother had hidden 20 years of accumulated evidence. "If the water levels are right, we might be able to access it tonight. Then we coordinate with the other teams to hit Pike's office and Pete's mine simultaneously before Thorn realizes what we're doing." As they prepared for what might be the most dangerous night of their lives, Elise found herself thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought her to this moment. Every tragedy in her life, her parents' deaths, the loss of their farm, the broken engagement that had left her with nothing, had been necessary to set her on the path that led to Willow Springs and this confrontation with the enemy who had shaped her family's destiny. The pendant her mother had left her pulsed with warmth against her chest, as if Elizabeth's spirit were somehow present to guide her daughter through the trials ahead. The deed to Willow Springs, now revealed as both inheritance and weapon, would either save them all or provide evidence of their destruction for whoever found their bodies in the desert. But as the sun set behind the western mountains and the desert stars began their nightly emergence, Elise Whitmore felt something she had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, fighting exactly the battle she had been born to fight. The war for her mother's legacy was about to reach its climax, and she intended to win it or die in the attempt. The cave behind the waterfall existed in a realm between myth and reality, accessible only during the brief period when underground water levels dropped to their seasonal minimum. As Wicasa had predicted, the springs were running lower than they had in weeks, revealing passages that were normally flooded beyond exploration. The entrance was hidden behind a curtain of stone that looked solid until you approached from exactly the right angle, when it revealed itself as an optical illusion created by overlapping rock formations. Elise Dassan and Wicasa made the journey into the mountain's heart, while the diversionary attacks drew Thorn's attention to other parts of the territory. The passage was treacherous, beyond anything they had imagined. Narrow tunnels that required crawling on hands and knees, chambers filled with poisonous gases from underground springs, and sheer drops that could only be navigated by rope and faith. But the pendant her mother had left her proved invaluable in the subterranean darkness. The blue stone glowed with increasing intensity as they moved deeper into the mountain, reacting to some mineral in the cave walls to provide just enough light to navigate by. More importantly, it grew warmer as they approached their destination, as if guided by some internal compass that Elizabeth had somehow encoded into the crystal structure. The chamber they finally discovered took their breath away. Elizabeth Whitmore had spent years creating a repository that was part archive, part shrine, and part arsenal in the war against corruption. Wooden crates lined the walls, each one carefully labeled and sealed against moisture, containing documents that chronicled decades of criminal activity throughout the territory. There were murder contracts with Pike's signature bribery receipts showing payments to territorial officials, correspondence between Thorne and Colorado politicians discussing the elimination of Elizabeth Whitmore, and detailed records of land fraud that implicated hundreds of supposedly legitimate property owners. But perhaps most damning of all were letters between Thorne and foreign mining interests, documenting his willingness to sell territorial secrets and resources to enemies of the United States in exchange for the funding he needed to build his criminal empire. Treason, Dasan said quietly, reading over one particularly incriminating document. Not just murder and land fraud, he's been selling information about military installations, troop movements, even Indian treaties to mining companies backed by European capital. But Elizabeth's repository contained more than just evidence of past crimes. Hidden in a separate chamber protected by additional barriers and accessible only with specific knowledge about the pendant's properties were detailed plans for Thorne's current conspiracy. She had somehow infiltrated his organization years before her death, gathering intelligence about his long-term strategy to seize control of the entire Southwest. The documents revealed the staggering scope of his ambition. Thorne wasn't just trying to steal water rights or mineral claims, he was orchestrating a complete transformation of territorial government, placing his creatures in every position of authority, from local sheriffs to federal administrators. The fake Apache attacks were only the beginning of a campaign designed to justify permanent military occupation of disputed areas with himself, as the military administrator in charge of pacifying the region. He's planning to declare martial law. Elise realized, studying a document that outlined the legal framework for Thorne's emergency powers. Not just in New Mexico territory, but eventually in Arizona, parts of Colorado, even northern Mexico. He wants to create his own private kingdom with himself as the undisputed ruler. Most chilling of all were the population control measures Thorne planned to implement once his authority was established. Apache communities would be relocated to reservation areas with no water or arable land, ensuring their gradual extinction through starvation and disease. Mexican families who had lived in the territory for generations would lose their citizenship and property rights, becoming essentially slave labor for Thorne's mining operations. Even Anglo settlers who opposed his rule would face administrative corrections that were clearly euphemisms for imprisonment or death. As they photographed the most crucial documents using a small camera that Dr. Carter had provided, Elise found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of her mother's sacrifice. Elizabeth had spent the last years of her life working alone against an enemy who commanded vast resources and had no moral limitations whatsoever. She had known that exposing Thorne's conspiracy would cost her everything, including quite possibly her life. But she had persevered in building the case that might someday save her daughter and countless other innocent people. But their subterranean expedition was interrupted by the sound of explosions echoing through the mountain above them. Thorne's forces had discovered their infiltration of the cave system and were using dynamite to seal the entrances, trying to trap them underground, where they would die slowly of suffocation or starvation. The diversionary attacks had failed to draw away enough of his men, and now they were running out of time to escape with the evidence they had gathered. The race through the collapsing tunnels became a nightmare of falling, rock-rising water and absolute darkness as the pendant's glow was overwhelmed by dust and debris. They had to abandon most of the documentary evidence, taking only the most crucial pieces that could fit in waterproof pouches, trusting that what they carried would be enough to expose Thorne's conspiracy, if they could survive to present it. They emerged from the mountain just as dawn was breaking over the desert, gasping and covered with mud, but alive and carrying proof of crimes that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. However, their relief was short-lived as they discovered that Thorne's fake Apache attacks had begun exactly on schedule, and the territory was already descending into the chaos he had so carefully orchestrated. Smoke was rising from multiple directions as settlements throughout the region came under assault from raiders whose war paint couldn't disguise their European features or their unfamiliarity with traditional Apache weapons and tactics. But the deception was working. Territorial militia units were mobilizing to respond to what they believed was a coordinated native uprising, and emergency proclamations were already being issued that would give Thorne the legal authority he needed to seize disputed lands. Meanwhile, the other teams assigned to gather evidence from Pike's office and Pete's hidden mine were facing their own desperate struggles. Carson and a group of defectors had managed to break into the sheriff's strongbox, but they were now trapped in the building by loyal deputies who had no idea their boss was a criminal. Dr. Carter and Hannah Price were leading the expedition to the mountain mine, but they had encountered cave-ins and flooding that made their mission far more dangerous than anticipated. As the sun climbed higher and the desert heat began its daily assault on everything that moved, Elise realized that their carefully coordinated plan was falling apart in the face of Thorne's superior numbers and preparation. But they were committed now. Retreat was impossible, and surrender would mean death, not just for them, but for everyone in the territory who valued freedom over tyranny. The final phase of the battle for Willow Springs was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether the American West became a land of law and justice, or a feudal kingdom ruled by whoever had enough gold and guns to take what they wanted from the weak. Standing in the shadow of the mountain that had nearly become her tomb, holding documents that could save or damn an entire territory, Elise Whitmore prepared for the confrontation that would either vindicate her mother's 20-year struggle for justice or provide a fitting end to the family line that Lucian Thorne had sworn to destroy. The war was entering its final phase, and she intended to see it through to whatever end awaited them all. The battle for Copper Gulch began not with the grand charges and dramatic confrontations of military history, but with a series of carefully coordinated strikes that unfolded across the territory like a deadly chess game played with human lives. As the sun reached its zenith and the desert heat became a weapon in itself, Thorne's fake Apache raids were creating exactly the chaos he had planned, drawing territorial forces away from his mining stronghold, while providing justification for the emergency powers he was about to claim. But Elise and her allies had learned from their underground expedition that conventional tactics would not work against an enemy who controlled both the legal system and the military resources of the territory. Instead, they would have to fight like their Apache allies, using mobility surprise and intimate knowledge of the terrain to strike where Thorne least expected resistance. The approach to Copper Gulch took them through landscape that had been transformed by decades of intensive mining into something resembling the surface of an alien world. Slag heaps rose like artificial mountains, their surfaces still hot enough to shimmer in the afternoon sun. Abandoned mine shafts dotted the hillsides like wounds that refused to heal, while the air itself was thick with smoke from the smelters and the acrid smell of chemicals used to separate precious metals from worthless rock. The mine itself was a monument to industrial ambition, run amok, a complex of buildings, conveyor systems, and machinery that sprawled across several square miles of what had once been pristine desert. Steam-powered pumps worked continuously to keep the deeper shafts from flooding, while ore cars moved along elevated tracks carrying the wealth that had funded Thorne's conspiracy. The sound of machinery was constant and deafening, creating a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the approaching storm clouds. Thorne had turned his industrial complex into a fortress that would have impressed military engineers. Guard towers commanded all approaches, with riflemen positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would cut down any conventional assault. The main buildings were constructed of stone and steel, designed to withstand both Apache attacks and the occasional labor disputes that had punctuated the mine's history. Barbed wire surrounded the entire perimeter, and the single access road was controlled by a fortified gatehouse that could hold off a small army. But Elizabeth's hidden documents had included detailed plans of the mine's layout, including information about the underground tunnels that connected the main workings to the natural cave systems of the surrounding mountains. More importantly, they revealed the location of Thorne's private office and the vault where he kept his most sensitive documents, evidence that would either complete their case against him or, if destroyed, allow him to escape justice, even if his current conspiracy failed. The infiltration began at sunset, as the day shift ended and the skeleton crew that worked the night hours was taking over. Using the same underground passages that had brought them to Elizabeth's cache, teams of volunteers made their way through flooded tunnels and abandoned mine shafts, carrying waterproofed weapons and the grim determination. The people who understood they were fighting not just for their own lives, but for the future of everyone they loved. Elise found herself leading a group that included Dawson, several Apache warriors, and some of Carson's defectors who knew the mine's security procedures. Their mission was perhaps the most dangerous of all they had, to reach Thorne's private office and secure the documents that would prove his conspiracy reached all the way to Washington, while simultaneously preventing him from destroying evidence or escaping to continue his criminal enterprise from some other location. The journey through the mine's underground levels was like descending into an industrial version of hell. The tunnels were filled with poisonous gases from the smelting operations, while the machinery above created a constant rain of dust and debris that made breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. Worse, the narrow passages and frequent cave-ins meant that if they were discovered, there would be few escape routes and no possibility of rescue. But their underground approach allowed them to bypass Thorne's elaborate surface defenses and emerge directly in the heart of his operation. They surfaced through a maintenance shaft in the main processing building, finding themselves surrounded by the massive machinery that crushed ore and separated silver from worthless rock. The noise was overwhelming, the heat oppressive, and the air so thick with dust and steam that they could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the military manuals. Fought in the narrow spaces between industrial equipment with the constant threat of explosions from the boilers and chemical processing systems, it was less a conventional gunfight than a series of desperate individual combats scattered throughout the complex. The noise of the machinery masked the sound of gunfire, allowing the fighting to continue for precious minutes before Thorne's main security force realized they were under attack. Elise found herself separated from the others, pursuing Thorne through a maze of conveyor belts and ore crushers that created a landscape of moving metal and crushing death. The mining baron was older than she was, but he moved with the desperate energy of a man who understood that capture meant not just imprisonment, but the complete destruction of everything he had spent decades building. Their final confrontation took place in Thorne's private office, a luxurious space that seemed grotesquely out of place in the industrial wasteland that surrounded it. Persian carpets covered the floor, oil paintings decorated the walls, and a massive safe contained the documents that would either condemn him or provide his salvation. But the civilized appearance of the room was belied by the weapons mounted on the walls and the bulletproof glass that protected the windows. This was the lair of a man who ruled through fear and violence, no matter how he chose to decorate it. 20 years. Thorne snarled as he faced her across his mahogany desk, his silver hair disheveled and his expensive suit torn from his flight through the mine workings. 20 years I've waited for this moment, planned for it, dreamed of it. Your mother destroyed my life in Colorado, cost me everything I had worked to build. She turned respectable men against me, had my licenses revoked, made me a laughingstock among people who should have respected my vision. His face was twisted with a rage that had festered for decades, transforming what might once have been a successful businessman into something monstrous and inhuman. I swore then that I would have my revenge, that I would destroy her family completely and build something greater on the ruins of their lives. And I have this territory will be mine before the sun sets, and your death will be the final payment on a debt that has been 20 years in the collecting. But Elise had learned something in the weeks since her arrival in New Mexico territory, something that her sheltered life in Missouri could never have taught her. She had learned that survival sometimes required more than just good intentions and moral principles. It required the will to do whatever was necessary to protect the people and principles you loved, even if that meant becoming someone your former self would not have recognized. My mother was right to stop you, she said, raising her father's pistol with hands that no longer trembled. And I'm going to finish what she started. The gunfight that followed was brief and decisive. Thorne, for all his wealth and power, was still just a man who had spent decades hiding behind other people's violence, rather than developing his own skills with weapons. When faced with someone who had learned to shoot not for sport but for survival, his advantages meant nothing. But even as Thorne fell behind his desk, mortally wounded but still alive enough to speak, he managed one final revelation that changed everything Elise thought she understood about her family's history. "You think this ends with me?" He whispered, blood foaming on his lips as his punctured lungs struggled to function. "But I was never working alone. Your mother, your precious, righteous mother, she wasn't the innocent victim you think she was." With his dying breath, he pointed toward the safe that contained his most sensitive documents. "Look in there," he gasped. "See what your beloved Elizabeth really was before you celebrate your victory too loudly." The documents Elise found in Thorne's private safe were like receiving a second letter from beyond the grave. But this one shattered everything she had believed about her mother's motivations and methods. Elizabeth Whitmore hadn't just been a victim of Thorne's criminal conspiracy. She had been his partner in the early years, helping him establish the network of corruption and violence that had eventually consumed them both. The partnership had begun legitimately, with Elizabeth providing the geological expertise that identified the richest mining claims, while Thorne supplied the capital and political connections needed to develop them. But as their success grew, so did their willingness to use increasingly questionable methods to eliminate competition and maximize profits. Bribery, intimidation, and even occasional violence had become routine tools of their business relationship. The break between them had come when Thorne proposed expanding their operations to include the systematic displacement of Apache communities from lands that contained valuable mineral deposits. Elizabeth, who had developed genuine friendships among the native peoples and had seen the devastating effects of their earlier actions, had finally found a line she would not cross. Her refusal to participate in what amounted to genocide had triggered the conflict that eventually destroyed them both. But in exposing Thorne's crimes, Elizabeth had also been forced to confront her own guilt in creating the monster he had become. The evidence she had spent years collecting included documentation of her own participation in corruption and violence, a confession that would have destroyed her reputation and quite possibly led to criminal charges if it had ever become public. She was trying to atone. Elise realized, reading through documents that revealed the full scope of her mother's complicity in Thorne's early crimes. She couldn't undo what she had helped create, but she could try to prevent it from getting worse. The revelation forced her to reassess everything she thought she knew about her family's history. But it also provided the final pieces of evidence needed to destroy Thorne's conspiracy completely. Elizabeth's records didn't just document Thorne's crimes, they revealed the names and methods of every person involved in his network of corruption, from local sheriffs to federal administrators to foreign mining interests that had been manipulating American territorial policy for their own benefit. As the battle for control of the mine continued to rage around them, Elise secured the documents that would not only vindicate her mother's final years, but also expose a pattern of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. But the victory came at a personal cost that would take years to fully understand the knowledge that the mother she had idealized had been capable of terrible things, even if she had ultimately chosen to fight against the consequences of her own actions. The sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of federal marshals who had been summoned by Dr. Carter's telegraphs to the territorial capital. But these were legitimate law enforcement officers, not the corrupt imposters that Thorne had been using. And they carried warrants that would begin the process of dismantling the criminal network that had controlled the territory for decades. As the sun set behind the western mountains and the smoke of battle began to clear, Elise stood in the ruins of Thorne's industrial empire and tried to process the magnitude of what had been accomplished. They had won. Thorne was dead, his conspiracy was exposed, and the territory would finally have a chance to develop according to the rule of law, rather than the whims of whoever could afford the most guns. But the victory felt different than she had expected, complicated by the knowledge of her mother's moral compromises and the understanding that justice was rarely as simple or satisfying as the story suggested. Elizabeth Whitmore had been neither the perfect victim nor the noble hero that Elise had imagined. She had been a flawed human being who made terrible mistakes, but ultimately chose to spend her final years trying to prevent others from suffering the consequences of those mistakes. The battle for Willow Springs was over, but the war for the soul of the American West would continue for generations. At least now, it would be fought by people who understood the difference between justice and revenge, between progress and exploitation, between building something lasting and simply taking whatever could be seized by force. The trials that followed the destruction of Thorne's criminal empire became a sensation that attracted attention from newspapers, politicians, and reformers across the nation. For 6 months, witness after witness testified to the scope of the conspiracy that had controlled New Mexico territory, revealing a web of corruption that implicated officials from local sheriffs all the way to congressional representatives in Washington. The evidence that Elise and her allies had gathered proved overwhelming in both quantity and quality. Elizabeth's meticulous records, combined with the documents from Thorne's private safe and the testimony of defectors like Carson, painted a picture of systematic criminality that shocked even experienced federal prosecutors. The fake Apache raids, the bribery of territorial officials, the murder contracts, and most damning of all, the correspondence with foreign mining interests that constituted treason against the United States. Sheriff Pike's death in the mine tunnels meant he escaped earthly justice. But the evidence found in his personal effects implicated dozens of other corrupt officials throughout the territory. The resulting investigations and trials would continue for years, gradually cleaning out a network of corruption that had strangled honest government and economic development across the Southwest. But perhaps the most satisfying moment of the entire legal process came when Thorne's surviving associates attempted to claim that their crimes were justified by the threat posed by hostile Apache. The federal prosecutor's response was devastating. He presented evidence that every single Apache attack in the territory over the past 5 years had been staged by white men in war paint, while the real Apache communities had been struggling desperately to avoid any conflicts that might justify military retaliation. The revelation led to a complete reassessment of federal Indian policy in the region. Traditional Apache water rights were not only recognized, but expanded with legal protections that would prevent future encroachment by mining interests or territorial speculators. Several Apache leaders, including Nal Nish and Wikesa, were appointed to advisory positions with the territorial government, ensuring that native voices would be heard in decisions affecting their communities. The silver vein beneath Willow Springs proved even richer than Elizabeth's notes had suggested, making Elise wealthy beyond anything she had imagined during her impoverished years in Missouri. But she used her newfound fortune with the wisdom that came from understanding both the corrupting power of wealth and the responsibility that came with it. Her first act was to establish a fund that compensated families who had suffered from Thorne's crimes, providing support for widows, orphans, and communities that had been devastated by his conspiracy. She also funded the construction of schools throughout the territory, with a particular emphasis on institutions that served both Anglo and Apache children, teaching them to navigate between two worlds while honoring the best traditions of both cultures. Hannah Price became the superintendent of this educational system, bringing her passion for learning and her gift for working with diverse communities to the task of preparing a new generation for the challenges of a changing world. Dr. Carter used grants from Elise's foundation to establish the first real hospital in the territory, equipped with modern medical instruments and staffed by doctors who had been trained in the latest techniques. The facility served everyone, regardless of their ability to pay their race or their past affiliations with any of the parties in the recent conflict. Walter Briggs's farm became a model of desert agriculture using innovative irrigation techniques developed through cooperation between Anglo engineering knowledge and Apache understanding of desert water management. The success of his crops attracted other farmers to the region, creating an agricultural boom that provided alternatives to the boom and bust cycles of mining that had previously dominated the territorial economy. 6 months after the battle at Copper Gulch, Whispering Pines had transformed itself from a rough mining town into something approaching a genuine community. The artificial tensions that had divided different groups had been replaced by the kind of cooperation that was necessary for survival in the harsh but beautiful landscape of the Southwest. The transformation was most evident in the relationship between different peoples throughout the territory. Apache communities secure in their legal water rights and no longer threatened by false accusations of hostility had begun developing economic partnerships with territorial settlements. Traditional crafts found markets among Anglo settlers, while Apache knowledge of desert survival and resource management proved invaluable to farmers and ranchers who were learning to work with the land rather than simply exploiting it. But it was at Willow Springs itself that the most important changes had taken place. The ranch house that Elise and Dasan had built overlooked the oasis like a promise of permanence in a land that had known too much violence and upheaval. Their marriage, performed by the federal judge who had presided over the corruption trials, symbolized not just personal happiness, but the possibility of building something lasting in the American West. The ceremony itself became a celebration that brought together people from across the territory and beyond. Apache warriors rode alongside federal marshals, former enemies shared food and stories, and children who had grown up in the shadow of racial conflict played together without the suspicions and fears that had poisoned their parents' generation. Wicasa fully recovered from his wounds and honored throughout the territory as a hero who had helped expose corruption and bring justice to the frontier, performed the traditional Apache marriage rituals while the federal judge handled the legal requirements. The combination of ceremonies reflected the blending of cultures that was beginning to characterize the new Southwest. Not the forced assimilation that government policies had previously demanded, but a voluntary sharing of traditions that enriched everyone involved. During the months that followed, as Elise and Dasan worked together to build both their ranch and their marriage, she found herself thinking often about the complex legacy her mother had left her. Elizabeth Whitmore had not been the perfect hero that childhood memories had created. She had been a flawed human being who made terrible mistakes, but ultimately chose to spend her final years trying to prevent others from suffering the consequences of those mistakes. The knowledge of her mother's early complicity in Thorne's crimes had been painful to accept, but it had also provided a more realistic understanding of the moral complexities that faced everyone trying to build a life in the frontier territories. The choice was rarely between perfect good and absolute evil. It was usually between degrees of compromise, between accepting small injustices to prevent larger ones, between the idealism of youth and the pragmatism of experience. Elizabeth's final years had been devoted to documenting and exposing the criminal network she had helped create, knowing that her efforts would probably cost her everything, including her life. She had chosen to sacrifice her reputation, her safety, and ultimately her existence in order to provide her daughter with the weapons needed to fight a battle that Elizabeth could not finish herself. The pendant that had revealed so many secrets now hung in the parlor of their ranch house, a family heirloom that would someday be passed down to children who would grow up in a very different world than the one their parents had known. The deed to Willow Springs was framed beside it, no longer just a legal document, but a symbol of the principle that justice could prevail even when the odds seemed impossible. Dassan's work as liaison between Apache communities and territorial authorities kept him traveling frequently, but he always returned to the oasis they had made their home. His efforts were bearing fruit in ways that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of Thorne's conspiracy. Traditional Apache knowledge was being incorporated into territorial resource management, while young Apache men and women were gaining the education and skills they needed to protect their community's interests in a changing world. Their children, when they came, would grow up speaking both English and Apache, learning to ride horses through the desert canyons where their parents had once fled for their lives, but riding as free citizens of a territory where justice had finally taken root in the harsh but beautiful soil. They would know the history of their mixed heritage, the courage and mistakes of both cultures, the prices paid for survival, and the ongoing responsibility to build something better than what had come before. The silver mine beneath Willow Springs continued to produce wealth, but that wealth was shared throughout the community in ways that built prosperity rather than destroying it. Mining operations were conducted with respect for the environment and the water sources that made life possible in the desert. Workers were paid fair wages and provided with safe working conditions, while the profits funded schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects that benefited everyone in the territory. On quiet evenings, when the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods and the stars emerged in their brilliant profusion above the clear air of the southwest, Elise would sometimes stand by the springs where it all began and think about the chain of events that had brought her to this place. Every tragedy in her life, her parents' deaths and the loss of their farm, the broken engagement that had seemed like the end of the world, had been necessary to set her on the path that led to this moment. She had learned that justice was not a destination, but a continuous process requiring constant vigilance and the willingness to make difficult choices when easier alternatives presented themselves. The battle against corruption and exploitation would never be completely won. There would always be new thorns, new conspiracies, new challenges to the principle that right should triumph over might. But she had also learned that good people could prevail against overwhelming odds if they were willing to stand together and fight for something larger than their individual interests. The alliance that had destroyed Thorne's empire, Apache warriors and Anglo settlers, teachers, and farmers, lawmen, and former outlaws, had been built on the understanding that their different backgrounds and cultures were sources of strength rather than division. The water continued to flow from the ancient springs, clean and clear and eternal, a reminder that some things endured beyond human ambition and conflict. The silver that lay beneath the surface would eventually be exhausted, and the buildings they had constructed would someday crumble, and the people who had fought these battles would be forgotten by all but historians and their own descendants. But the principles they had fought for, justice over greed, cooperation over exploitation law, over violence, those would endure as long as people were willing to sacrifice for them. The American West could be more than a place where the strong preyed on the weak. It could be a land where different peoples worked together to build something greater than any of them could achieve alone. Standing in the starlight beside the springs that had given their struggle its name, Elise Whitmore understood that she had been given more than an inheritance from her mother. She had been given a purpose, a mission that would continue long after her own battles were finished. The pendant around her neck had revealed its secrets, but it remained a symbol of the ongoing responsibility to protect the innocent, expose the corrupt, and build something lasting in a world where nothing was guaranteed except the opportunity to try. Her mother's voice echoed one final time in her memory. "Be strong, my daughter. Be stronger than I was." She had been strong. She had been strong enough to survive, to fight, to forgive, and most importantly, to build something lasting. In a land that had finally learned the difference between justice and revenge, between progress and exploitation, between creating wealth and simply stealing it from others. In the end, that was enough. That was more than enough.